The smell of burning leaves and old brush had barely started drifting across my backyard when I heard the sirens, and my first thought was that someone nearby must have had a real emergency. Not that my peaceful Saturday morning was about to turn into an absolute circus. I was standing next to my burn pile with a rake in hand, watching the flames consume the mountain of yard waste I'd been accumulating for months. The fire was contained, controlled, and completely legal according to the yearly permit I'd obtained from the fire department back in January. My property in rural Georgia, just outside of Savannah, sat on 5 acres of heavily wooded land, and burning was pretty much the only practical way to deal with all the debris that accumulated from maintaining the property. The sirens got louder, and I realized with growing confusion that they were heading up my long driveway. A fire truck emerged through the trees, followed by another emergency vehicle, and I stood there watching them approach with my mouth hanging open. What the hell was going on? The trucks came to a stop about 50 feet from my burn pile, and several firefighters jumped out, already assessing the situation. I walked toward them, still holding my rake like some kind of confused farmer in a comedy sketch. "Good morning, officers," I called out. "Is there a problem?" A tall man with Chief Morrison emblazoned on his helmet approached me, and I could see the moment of recognition cross his face. He actually sighed and shook his head. "Xavier Irons, right?" he asked. "That's me," I confirmed. "What's going on?" "We got a call about an illegal burn," Chief Morrison explained. "Someone reported that you were creating a fire hazard and violating county ordinances." He looked past me at the modest fire burning in the cleared area I'd designated for burns. "But unless I'm mistaken, you're the guy who comes in every January like clockwork to renew his burn permit." "That's exactly right," I said, relief washing over me. "I've got the permit posted right here." I gestured to the metal post I'd driven into the ground near the burn area, where I kept my permit in a weatherproof sleeve for exactly this kind of situation. Chief Morrison walked over and examined it, then pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Morrison. The burn at 4750 Whisper Pine Road is authorized. Property owner has a valid yearly permit on file and on display. No violation, no hazard. We're clearing the scene." The voice on the other end acknowledged, and I heard one of the other firefighters chuckle. "Let me guess," the younger guy said. "HOA call, probably," Chief Morrison replied, then turned to me. "Xavier, do you know who might have called this in?" "I've got a pretty good idea," I said darkly. "The new HOA president has been making my life hell for the past 6 months." Chief Morrison nodded knowingly. "Linda Patterson." "You know her?" I asked, surprised. "Unfortunately," he said with another sigh. "This is the 3rd false report she's made this month. Last week she called us out to the Henderson property because they were grilling on their deck, said it was a fire hazard. Week before that, she reported the Martinez family for having a campfire in their fire pit." "Are you serious?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What's her problem?" "Power trip, mostly," Chief Morrison said. "Look, Xavier, you're doing everything right. Your burn pile is in a cleared area, you've got water nearby, the wind conditions are appropriate, and you've got a valid permit. She can't do anything about it." "She's sure going to try," I muttered. The firefighters packed up and left, and I went back to tending my fire, but my peaceful Saturday had been thoroughly ruined. I kept expecting to see Linda's white Mercedes come rolling up the driveway, ready to lecture me about some imaginary violation. The woman had been a thorn in my side ever since she'd been elected HOA president last fall. Our neighborhood was a strange hybrid. Most of the properties were like mine, large lots carved out of the Georgia pine forests, where people wanted space and privacy. but a developer had added a small cluster of smaller homes near the entrance about 5 years ago, and that's where Linda and her cronies lived. They wanted a pristine, manicured suburban paradise, while the rest of us just wanted to be left alone on our wooded acreage. The fire burned down over the next few hours, and I made sure to stay with it until it was nothing but smoldering ash, even though my permit didn't require me to. I wasn't giving Linda any ammunition. By early afternoon, I was tired, covered in ash, and ready for a shower and a beer. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard someone pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding, like they were trying to break it down. Pulling on jeans and a t-shirt, I headed downstairs, already knowing who I'd find on the other side. Sure enough, through the frosted glass of my front door, I could see Linda Patterson's distinctive platinum blonde hair and her rigid, angry posture. I opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Can I help you, Linda?" "You absolutely can," she snapped, her face already red with anger. "You can explain to me why you think it's acceptable to create a massive fire hazard in a residential neighborhood." "It's not a fire hazard, and I have a permit," I said calmly. "The fire chief confirmed it himself this morning." "I don't care about your supposed permit," Linda shot back. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that no resident can create excessive smoke or odors that disturb their neighbors." "Then I guess it's a good thing the HOA doesn't supersede county and state fire regulations," I replied. "My burn pile is legal, Linda. Chief Morrison confirmed it." "You wasted the fire department's time this morning." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "We'll see about that. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for Monday night, and this issue will be addressed." "You do that," I said. "Is there anything else?" "You have until Monday to show proper respect for this community's standards," Linda said, "or there will be consequences." She turned on her heel and stalked back to her Mercedes, which she'd parked right in front of my garage, blocking my driveway. I watched her peel out, leaving tire marks on my gravel drive, and shook my head. This was going to get worse before it got better. Monday evening came faster than I wanted. The HOA meeting was being held at the community center near the neighborhood entrance, and I showed up with copies of my burn permit, the county ordinances, and a general attitude of someone who was completely done with nonsense. The community center was a modest building that served as a meeting place for various neighborhood activities. Tonight, it was packed. Apparently, Linda had spread the word that there was going to be some kind of showdown, and people loved drama. I recognized most of the faces. There were the old-timers like George Patterson, who'd been here since before the HOA even existed, the Miller family who'd moved in a few years ago, and the cluster of newer residents who'd bought the smaller homes and seemed to think they lived in a gated community instead of rural Georgia. Linda sat at the front table with her board members, Brenda Carlisle and Susan Mitchell, both women who seemed to share Linda's vision of turning our relaxed rural neighborhood into something out of a suburban nightmare. They whispered among themselves as people filed in, occasionally shooting looks in my direction. "Thank you all for coming," Linda began once the room had settled. "We're here tonight to address a serious safety violation that occurred this past Saturday." "There was no violation," I called out from my seat. "I have documentation." "You'll have your turn to speak, Xavier," Linda said coldly. "Right now, I'm presenting the facts. On Saturday morning, multiple residents reported seeing large amounts of smoke coming from your property. When concerned citizens investigated, they found an uncontrolled fire burning dangerously close to the tree line." "That's not true," I interrupted. "The fire was completely controlled and over 100 feet from the nearest trees." "Xavier, you're out of order," Linda snapped. As I was saying, This fire posed a significant risk to neighboring properties and violated multiple HOA regulations regarding nuisances and hazards. George Patterson raised his hand. "Linda, did the fire department find any violations?" Linda's jaw tightened. "The fire department was called to the scene, yes. However, their assessment doesn't supersede HOA authority on community standards." "So that's a no," George said. "They didn't find any violations. What they found or didn't find is irrelevant," Brenda chimed in. "The HOA has the right to enforce stricter standards than county regulations." "Actually, you don't," I said, standing up and holding my documentation. "The county fire marshal's office has clear regulations about burn permits and what authority HOAs have regarding them, which is none. My burn pile was legal, permitted, and properly maintained. Chief Morrison himself confirmed this on Saturday." "Chief Morrison is not the final authority here," Susan said primly. "The HOA board has discussed this issue at length, and we've decided to implement a new policy. Effective immediately, all outdoor burning is prohibited within neighborhood boundaries." The room erupted. People started shouting over each other, most of them angry at this sudden declaration. Outdoor burning was a way of life out here. We had acreage, we had debris, and burning was the most practical and economical way to deal with it. "You can't just ban burning," someone yelled from the back. "We've got property rights." "The HOA covenant gives us broad authority to regulate activities that affect property values and neighborhood character," Linda replied, her voice rising above the chaos. "This board has determined that outdoor burning is incompatible with the image we want to project." "What image?" George demanded. "We're in the middle of the woods. This isn't some cookie sea-cutter suburb." "That's exactly the attitude we're trying to change," Brenda said. "This neighborhood has potential to be something special, something refined. But we can't get there if residents insist on treating their properties like rural junkyards." I felt my temper rising. "My property is not a junkyard. It's 5 acres of well-maintained forest land, and I manage it according to proper forestry practices, which includes controlled burns of debris. This is Georgia. This is what people do." "Not in this neighborhood, not anymore," Linda said firmly. "The vote is 3-0 from the board. No outdoor burning, effective immediately. Anyone who violates this policy will face fines starting at $500. "You need to put this to a community vote," I argued. "You can't just unilaterally change major policies." According to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, the board can implement emergency safety measures without a community vote if they determine there's an imminent hazard. Susan read from a document in front of her. "We've determined that outdoor burning constitutes such a hazard." "That's insane," I said. "There's no imminent hazard. You're abusing your authority." "This meeting is adjourned," Linda announced, standing up. "The new policy is in effect. Anyone with questions can contact the board in writing." The 3 women gathered their papers and headed for a side door, ignoring the shouting and protests from the assembled residents. I stood there, furious and disbelieving, as the room dissolved into chaos around me. George approached me, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous, Xavier. She's out of control." "What can we do about it?" I asked. "Well, for starters, most of what she just said is garbage," George replied. He was retired now, but he'd been a real estate attorney for 30 years. "The HOA can't override county fire regulations, and they definitely can't implement a blanket ban without proper procedure. That emergency provision she cited requires documented proof of imminent danger and notification to all residents at least 48 hours in advance." "So the policy isn't valid, not even close," George confirmed. But Linda doesn't care about validity. She cares about intimidation. She's betting that most people won't fight back because they don't want the hassle. Well, she picked the wrong person to mess with, I said. Over the next few days, I did my research. I contacted the county fire marshal's office, spoke with a real estate attorney that George recommended, and gathered every piece of documentation I could find about HOA authority and fire regulations in Georgia. What I learned was enlightening and infuriating in equal measure. Linda's emergency policy was completely invalid. The HOA had no authority to ban an activity that was explicitly permitted by county regulations, especially without following proper procedures for bylaw amendments. The emergency provision she'd cited required specific conditions that clearly didn't exist. She'd essentially made up a rule and hoped no one would challenge it. On Thursday afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a violation notice claiming that I had burned yard waste on Saturday in violation of HOA policy, and demanding payment of a $500 fine within 10 days. The letter was signed by Linda and included a warning that failure to pay would result in a lien being placed on my property. I called George immediately. Can she do this? Can she fine me for something I did before her fake policy even existed? Absolutely not, George said. That's ex post facto enforcement, and it's not legal even in HOA disputes. Plus, you didn't violate anything to begin with. Don't pay that fine, Xavier. In fact, I think it's time we went on offense. What do you mean? I mean, we file a complaint with the state HOA regulatory board and we sue her personally for harassment and abuse of authority, George explained. I've been talking to other residents. Linda's been pulling stuff like this since she took office. Fake violations, arbitrary fines, threats of liens. She's using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, and it's time someone stopped her. I'm in, I said without hesitation. What do we need to do? George and I spent the next week building our case. It turned out that Linda had been even busier than I'd realized. She'd fined the Henderson family $300 for parking their RV in their own driveway for more than 24 hours, even though there was no such restriction in the actual HOA bylaws. She'd threatened the Martinez family with daily fines for painting their house, a color she deemed inappropriate, despite that color being well within the approved palette. She'd sent violation notices to at least a dozen properties for things like mailbox styles, lawn ornaments, and tree placement, none of which were actually covered by any HOA rules. The woman had invented an entire shadow code of regulations that existed only in her head, and in the threatening letters she sent out. Even better, or worse depending on how you looked at it, she'd been depositing the fine payments into a separate bank account that she controlled personally, not the main HOA account. That's embezzlement, the attorney George had connected me with said when we showed her the financial records we'd obtained. Her name was Margaret Anderson, and she specialized in HOA disputes. She's not just overstepping her authority, she's stealing money from residents under false pretenses. What's our next move? I asked. We file a civil suit against Linda personally and against the HOA board members as co-defendants for failure to exercise proper oversight, Margaret explained. We also file a complaint with the state, and honestly, we should probably loop in the district attorney's office. If she's taken more than a few $1,000s, this could be criminal fraud. How much has she taken? George asked. Margaret reviewed the documents we'd gathered. Based on these records, at least $12,000 over the past 6 months. Could be more if there are payments we don't know about. Jesus, I muttered. All of this over a burn pile. It's never really about the burn pile, Margaret said. It's about control. People like Linda get a little bit of authority and they become drunk on it. She probably started with good intentions, thinking she was improving the neighborhood, but it spiraled into something else entirely. We filed the lawsuit the following Monday, and the reaction was immediate. Linda showed up at my house Tuesday morning, and this time she wasn't alone. She'd brought Brenda and Susan with her, and all three of them looked furious. "You're suing us," Linda shrieked before I'd even fully opened the door. "After everything we've done for this neighborhood." "You mean after you invented fake violations and stole thousands of dollars from residents?" I replied calmly. "Yeah, Linda, I'm suing you. And the district attorney's office is reviewing the case for criminal charges." Her face went pale. "Criminal charges? You can't be serious." "Embezzlement is a crime," I said. "Taking money under false pretenses is fraud. You've been running a scam for 6 months and now you're going to face consequences." "This is ridiculous," Brenda sputtered. "We were enforcing community standards." "You were making up rules and pocketing the fines," I corrected. "There's a difference. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." Susan started crying, actual tears running down her face. "We didn't know," she sobbed. "Linda said it was all legal. She said the money was going to neighborhood improvements." "Susan, shut up," Linda hissed. "No, I won't shut up," Susan shot back. "You told us everything was by the book. You said you'd consulted with attorneys. This whole time you've been lying." "I haven't been lying about anything," Linda insisted. "These regulations are necessary for maintaining property values. If people like Xavier can just do whatever they want, the whole neighborhood will turn into a slum." "I burned yard waste on my own property with a valid permit," I said. "The only criminal here is you, Linda." The three women left, with Susan still crying and arguing with Linda as they walked to their cars. I watched them go, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. This whole thing had spiraled so far beyond a simple burn pile that it was almost absurd. The lawsuit moved forward over the next several weeks. Margaret was efficient and thorough, and the more we dug into Linda's records, the worse it got. She'd been running her scam even longer than we'd initially thought. The $12,000 we'd found was just from the fines we could easily document. When Margaret subpoenaed Linda's bank records, we discovered she'd taken closer to $30,000 over the past year. She'd been clever about it, spacing out the violations and targeting different residents so no one compared notes. She'd also been targeting newer residents who didn't know the actual HOA rules and were more likely to just pay the fine rather than fight back. It was a systematic operation, and she'd gotten away with it because most people didn't want the hassle of challenging the HOA. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation in early March. Detective Sarah Williams was assigned to the case, and she was remarkably thorough. She interviewed residents, reviewed financial records, and built a case that went far beyond anything George and I had initially uncovered. "This is one of the more brazen cases I've seen," Detective Williams told me during one of our meetings. "Mrs. Patterson wasn't even trying to hide it. She kept detailed records of every fake fine, every threatening letter, every payment. She genuinely believed she was entitled to this money." "What's going to happen to her?" I asked. "That's up to the DA and eventually a judge," Detective Williams said. "But based on what we've found, she's looking at multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. The total amount is over $30,000, which makes it a felony." The arraignment happened on a rainy Tuesday in late March. Linda showed up with an expensive lawyer and an attitude that suggested she still didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her attorney gave a statement to the press about how his client was being persecuted for trying to maintain neighborhood standards. The trial was scheduled for June, which gave us months of uncomfortable neighborhood tension. Linda remained defiant, still living in her house at the neighborhood entrance, still driving past my property with a look of pure hatred whenever our paths crossed. The HOA had suspended her as president, but she refused to officially resign, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. Brenda and Susan both accepted plea deals early on. They testified that Linda had misled them about the legality of her actions and had kept the financial records hidden from the rest of the board. They both received probation and were required to make restitution payments, but avoided jail time since they cooperated with the prosecution. My life slowly returned to normal during this period. I continued to burn yard waste as needed, always careful to follow every regulation to the letter. I wasn't going to give anyone ammunition to claim I was doing anything wrong. Other neighbors started reaching out to thank me for standing up to Linda. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been intimidated by her tactics, but I was the first one who'd actually fought back. George and I also filed for a complete reform of the HOA structure. We got enough signatures to force a special election, and we rewrote large sections of the bylaws to prevent anyone from wielding that kind of unchecked power again. The new bylaws required transparency in all financial matters, mandatory community votes for any policy changes, and a clear process for removing board members who abused their authority. The trial in June was almost anticlimactic. The prosecution had mountains of evidence, including Linda's own meticulous records of her fake violations and the payments she'd collected. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she genuinely believed she was acting within her authority, but it fell flat when the prosecution showed emails where Linda had discussed with her personal accountant how to hide the money from the HOA's official books. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Linda sat stone-faced as the verdicts were read, her lawyer immediately filing notice of appeal, but everyone in the courtroom knew it was over. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge was a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd clearly reviewed the case thoroughly. She gave a statement about how HOA board members hold positions of trust within their communities, and how Linda had betrayed that trust in the most egregious way possible. Linda was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of the $30,000 she'd stolen, plus additional fines and court costs. Her lawyer immediately filed an appeal, but the general consensus was that it wouldn't go anywhere. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the sentence was actually on the lighter end of what she could have received. I watched from the gallery as they led Linda away in handcuffs. Part of me felt bad for her. She'd let power and control become an obsession, and it had destroyed her life. But mostly I felt relieved that it was finally over. The neighborhood slowly healed over the following months. The new HOA board, which included George and several other longtime residents, focused on actual community improvement projects rather than petty enforcement actions. We repaired roads, upgraded the community center, and organized neighborhood events that brought people together instead of driving them apart. I continued to maintain my property the way I always had, burning debris when needed, always with my valid permit on display. The fire department never got called to my place again. Chief Morrison stopped by once just to check in, and we had a good laugh about the whole situation. You know, in 20 years of doing this job, I've seen a lot of HOA drama, he told me, but Linda Patterson takes the cake. That woman called us out to your place, to the Hendersons' place, to at least 5 other properties, all for completely legal activities. She wasted hundreds of hours of emergency response time because she was on a power trip. "Well, she's paying for it now," I said. "That she is," Chief Morrison agreed. "Hey, your permit's up for renewal in January, right?" "Like clockwork," I confirmed. "Good man," he said with a smile. "Keep doing what you're doing, Xavier. This neighborhood needs more people like you and fewer people like Linda Patterson." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The civil lawsuit resulted in a settlement that paid back all the residents who'd been scammed, plus damages. Linda's house went up for sale to pay the restitution and fines, and it sat empty for months before finally selling to a young family who just wanted to live in peace and quiet. I ran into Susan at the grocery store one day in late fall. She looked tired but less stressed than the last time I'd seen her. "Xavier," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have questioned what Linda was doing. I should have looked at the records myself instead of just trusting her." "We all make mistakes," I said. "The important thing is that you did the right thing in the end." "I still feel terrible about it," Susan admitted. "All those people we hurt, all that money Linda stole. I knew something felt off, but I didn't want to believe she was lying to us." "Linda was very good at manipulation," I said. "She made you believe you were doing the right thing. That's on her, not you." Susan nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for standing up to her. If you hadn't, she'd probably still be doing it." We talked for a few more minutes and then went our separate ways. I left the store thinking about how quickly things could spiral out of control, how a simple dispute over a burn pile had uncovered a much larger criminal operation, and how important it was to stand up against abuse of power, even when it came from unexpected places. January rolled around again, and I made my annual trip to the fire department to renew my burn permit. It was the same process it had always been: fill out the form, pay the small fee, get the permit. Chief Morrison processed it personally and handed it over with a grin. "Another year, another permit," he said. "Think you'll have any trouble from the new HOA board?" "I don't think so," I replied. "They're actually focused on real issues now instead of inventing problems." "That's good to hear," Chief Morrison said. "You know, we use your case in training now. We teach our guys about the limits of HOA authority and how to recognize when someone's making a false report for personal reasons." "Seriously?" I asked, surprised. "Absolutely," he confirmed. "Linda Patterson made so many false reports that it became a pattern. We need our guys to recognize that pattern and know how to handle it without wasting resources. Your situation is a perfect example of someone with a valid permit being harassed by an HOA with an agenda." I left the fire department with my new permit and a strange sense of pride. What had started as a frustrating confrontation had turned into something that might actually prevent other people from being harassed the same way. The first burn of the new year happened on a clear, cold Saturday in February. I'd spent the previous few weeks clearing deadfall and trimming trees, and I had a substantial pile ready to go. I posted my permit, checked the wind conditions, prepared my water source, and lit the fire exactly the way I'd done dozens of times before. The flames caught and spread through the dry wood and brush, sending up a column of smoke into the winter sky. I stood watching it, rake in hand, enjoying the simple satisfaction of a job well done. No sirens this time. No angry HOA president screaming about fake violations. Just me, my property, and a perfectly legal, perfectly safe burn pile. George stopped by later that afternoon, bringing a 6-pack of beer and an easy grin. We sat in lawn chairs near the dying fire, drinking beer and talking about neighborhood gossip, upcoming projects, and the general state of things. "You know what the best part about all of this is?" George said after his second beer. We actually have a functioning HOA now. We're doing real work, making real improvements, and nobody's getting fake fines or threatening letters." "That is pretty great," I agreed. "How's the new playground project coming along?" "Should break ground next month," George said. "We've got volunteers lined up, materials ordered, and actual community support because people know we're not wasting their money or making up rules for the hell of it." "Amazing what you can accomplish when you're not running a criminal enterprise," I said dryly. George laughed. "Right. I still can't believe Linda thought she could get away with it. $30,000, Xavier, over fake violations she invented herself. The audacity of it. She probably would have gotten away with it if she hadn't picked a fight over my burn pile," I mused. "If she'd just left me alone, I never would have dug into her records or talked to an attorney." "That's the thing about people like Linda," George said. "They can't help themselves. They have to control everything and everyone, and eventually they push too hard against the wrong person." We finished our beers as the sun set over the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, safe and contained, exactly as it should be. I felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction, not just because I'd won a fight with a corrupt HOA president, but because I'd helped protect my entire community from someone who'd abused her power. The following Monday, I got a call from Margaret Anderson, the attorney who'd handled my case. "Xavier, I wanted to let you know that Linda Patterson's appeal was denied. The conviction stands and she'll be serving her full sentence with eligibility for parole at 18 months. "That's good to hear," I said. "Thanks for letting me know." "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Your case has gotten attention from state lawmakers. There's a bill being proposed that would create stricter oversight of HOA boards and clearer guidelines about what authority they actually have. They're calling it the HOA Accountability Act." "You're kidding," I said, stunned. "Nope," Margaret replied. "Your case exposed a lot of problems with how HOAs operate in Georgia. Linda Patterson wasn't the only board member abusing her power. She was just the most egregious. Lawmakers realized they needed to create better protections for homeowners." "That's incredible," I said. "All because she called the fire department on my burn pile." Margaret laughed. "Sometimes big changes start with small incidents. You stood up for yourself, which uncovered a pattern of abuse, which led to criminal charges, which exposed systemic problems. That's how reform happens." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while, processing everything that had happened over the past year. It had started with such a simple thing, burning yard waste on my own property with a valid permit. Linda could have just minded her own business. She could have checked with the fire department before calling them out. She could have followed actual HOA procedures instead of inventing fake ones. But she didn't, and her inability to control her need for power had destroyed her life and inadvertently improved the lives of countless homeowners across the state. There was a certain poetic justice to it. Spring arrived with warm weather and blooming flowers. The neighborhood was thriving under the new HOA leadership. The playground project was completed, looking fantastic and already popular with local families. Road repairs were finished ahead of schedule and under budget. A neighborhood barbecue drew over 100 residents, all of them enjoying good food and good company without worrying about violating some fake rule. I spent a Saturday in May doing another controlled burn, this time with several neighbors stopping by to chat and make sure I wasn't having any problems. It was a completely different atmosphere from the previous year. People were friendly, supportive, and not at all concerned about my legal, permitted activity. The fire department didn't show up. The HOA didn't send any letters. Nobody accused me of anything. It was gloriously, peacefully boring, exactly the way it should have been all along. Chief Morrison stopped by the following week, not because of any emergency, but just to drop off some information about a community fire safety program the department was starting. We talked for a while on my front porch, and he mentioned that false reports to the fire department had dropped significantly since Linda's conviction. People realize there are consequences now, he explained. Word got around about Linda going to prison for fraud, and suddenly everyone's being more careful about what they report and why. It's made our jobs easier. Glad something good came out of it, I said. More than something, Chief Morrison corrected. You changed the whole dynamic in this county, Xavier. HOAs are being more careful, residents are more willing to stand up for themselves, and we're not wasting time on bogus calls. That's a win all around. Summer settled in with typical Georgia heat and humidity. I maintained my property, burned debris when needed, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of living on 5 wooded acres without anyone harassing me about fake violations. The new normal was so much better than the old one that it was almost hard to remember what it had been like dealing with Linda's constant interference. In August, I received an invitation to speak at a state committee, hearing about the proposed HOA Accountability Act. They wanted me to share my experience and explain how the lack of oversight had allowed Linda to abuse her power for so long. I agreed, figuring it was the least I could do if it might help other homeowners avoid similar situations. The hearing was held in Atlanta on a Wednesday morning. I took the day off work and drove up, wearing my best suit and carrying a folder full of documentation. The committee room was formal and intimidating, with legislators seated at a raised bench and witnesses testifying at a table below. When my turn came, I told my story as clearly and simply as I could. I explained about the burn pile, the fire department call, Linda's fake emergency policy, and how investigating that one incident had uncovered a much larger pattern of fraud and abuse. I showed them copies of the fake violation notices, the financial records, and the threatening letters Linda had sent to multiple residents. The committee members asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely concerned about preventing similar situations. One representative from rural Georgia thanked me specifically for standing up to Linda and bringing the whole thing to light. "Mr. Irons, your case has made it clear that we need better protections for homeowners and stricter accountability for HOA boards," she said. "The bill we're proposing would require regular audits, transparent financial reporting, and a clear appeals process for anyone who receives a violation notice. It would also create penalties for board members who abuse their authority." "That all sounds excellent," I said. If these protections had been in place last year, Linda never could have gotten away with what she did. The bill passed committee and moved forward through the legislative process. It was strange to think that my conflict with an overzealous HOA president had led to actual state law reform. But George had been right about how change happens. Sometimes you just need one person to stand up and fight back, and the ripple effects can reach much farther than you ever expected. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and changing leaves. I had another substantial burn pile ready to go in October, and this time I invited some of the neighbors over to watch. We made an event of it, grilling burgers and hot dogs while the fire burned, kids playing in the yard, adults talking and laughing. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be, people coming together and enjoying each other's company, not living in fear of fake violations or arbitrary fines. The HOA existed to serve the community, not to control it, and under the new leadership, that's exactly what it was doing. I got word in November that Linda had been denied early parole. She'd apparently been a difficult inmate, refusing to accept responsibility for her crimes and continuing to insist that she'd been doing what was best for the neighborhood. The parole board determined she hadn't shown sufficient remorse or rehabilitation, and she'd have to serve her full sentence. Part of me felt bad for her, but mostly I felt like justice was being served. She'd stolen $30,000 from her neighbors, harassed dozens of people with fake violations, and abused her power in the most egregious ways possible. 3 years in prison seemed like a reasonable consequence. December brought cold weather and preparations for the holidays. The neighborhood was decorated with lights and wreaths, and the new HOA organized a holiday party that drew almost the entire community. It was a far cry from the tense, divided neighborhood we'd been just a year and a half ago. George found me at the party, drink in hand and a huge smile on his face. "Xavier, my friend, I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For not backing down," George said. "For fighting back when Linda tried to bully you. For uncovering what she was doing and making sure she faced consequences. You saved this neighborhood, whether you realize it or not." "I just wanted to burn some brush," I said with a laugh. "And that's what makes it perfect," George replied. "You weren't looking for a fight, you were just standing up for your rights. That's exactly the kind of person this community needs." January rolled around again, and I made my now ritual trip to renew my burn permit. Chief Morrison processed it with the same efficiency as always, and we chatted about the past year and all the changes that had happened. "You know, Xavier, I've been doing this job for 22 years, he said as he handed over my new permit. "I've dealt with a lot of HOA issues, a lot of personality conflicts, a lot of people who think rules don't apply to them. But I've never seen anything quite like what happened with Linda Patterson, and I've never seen someone handle it as well as you did." "I just did what seemed right," I said. "That's exactly my point," Chief Morrison replied. "You followed the rules. You stood your ground when someone tried to bully you, and you made sure there were consequences for illegal behavior. That's how it's supposed to work." I left the fire department with my new permit and drove home through the quiet January morning. The neighborhood looked peaceful, the roads clear, the houses settled in for winter. It was hard to believe that just 2 years ago, I'd been dealing with fire trucks in my driveway and an HOA president screaming about fake violations. The first burn pile of the year went off without incident. No fire trucks, no angry confrontations, no threatening letters. Just me, my property, and a perfectly legal, perfectly safe controlled burn. It was wonderfully, blissfully boring. And that, I decided, was exactly how it should be. The final word came in March that the HOA Accountability Act had been signed into law by the governor. It would take effect July 1st and would apply to all homeowner associations across Georgia. The law required regular financial audits, transparent record-keeping, clear procedures for violations and appeals, and penalties for board members who abused their authority. Margaret Anderson called to congratulate me and to let me know that similar legislation was being considered in neighboring states. "Your case started something bigger than you probably imagined," she said. "You protected your community and ended up helping protect homeowners across the state and potentially the whole region." I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that something good had come from such a frustrating situation. Linda Patterson had tried to use her power to control and intimidate her neighbors, and instead, she'd inadvertently created a system that would prevent people like her from abusing their authority in the future. George stopped by that evening with a bottle of good whiskey to celebrate. We sat on my back porch, watching the sun set over the trees, talking about everything that had happened and everything that had changed. "You know what the best part is?" George said after his second glass. "We actually like our HOA now. People volunteer for projects. They show up to meetings. They're engaged with the community because they know their voices matter and their money isn't being stolen." "That is pretty great," I agreed. "All because you wouldn't let Linda Patterson intimidate you over a burn pile," George said with a laugh. "Sometimes the smallest battles lead to the biggest victories." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the whiskey and the evening air. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, exactly the way it should be. No drama, no conflict, no corrupt HOA president making everyone's lives miserable. Just a community of people living their lives, maintaining their properties, and treating each other with respect. It had taken a fight to get here, but it had been worth it. The anniversary of that first fire department call came and went without fanfare. I was burning another pile of yard waste on a Saturday morning, properly permitted and safely maintained, when I realized it had been exactly 2 years since Chief Morrison had shown up in my driveway to confirm my permit was valid. 2 years since Linda Patterson had decided to target me for following the law. 2 years since I discovered her fraud scheme and started the process that would eventually land her in prison and reform HOA law across the state. It seemed appropriate to mark the occasion, so I called George and invited him over for a beer. We sat by the burn pile, watching the flames consume the accumulated debris, talking about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. "You ever think about how different things would be if you just paid that first fake fine?" George asked. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Linda would probably still be HOA president, still stealing money, still making people miserable, and I'd be out $500. Instead, she's in prison. We've got good leadership, and there's a state law protecting homeowners," George said. "Not a bad outcome for standing your ground." "Not bad at all," I agreed. The fire burned down as we talked, eventually becoming nothing but glowing embers and ash. I'd stay with it until it was completely out, just as I always did, following every safety protocol and regulation to the letter. Because that's what responsible property owners did. That's what people with actual respect for their community did. Linda Patterson had claimed to be improving the neighborhood and maintaining standards, but really she'd just been feeding her own need for control and pocketing money that didn't belong to her. The real improvement had come after she was gone, when people who actually cared about the community stepped up to lead. As the sun set and the last embers died, I felt genuinely grateful for how everything had turned out. The fight had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had led to real, lasting change. Not just for me, not just for my neighborhood, but for homeowners across the entire state. All because I'd wanted to burn some brush on my own property, and someone had decided that wasn't allowed. Sometimes the smallest conflicts reveal the biggest problems, and sometimes standing up for something simple and straightforward can lead to consequences far beyond what you ever imagined. I went inside that night feeling content and satisfied. My property was well maintained, my burn pile was safely extinguished, and my neighborhood was thriving under honest leadership. Linda Patterson was serving her sentence and would eventually be released, hopefully having learned something about abuse of power and consequences. The HOA Accountability Act would protect countless homeowners from similar situations, and the precedent set by Linda's conviction would be tyrants think twice before abusing their authority. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and sometimes progress is all you can ask for. The next morning, I posted my yearly burn permit in its weatherproof sleeve on the metal post by my burn area, ready for whenever I needed it next. The permit was valid for another 11 months, and I had no doubt I'd use it many more times before renewal came around again. Because this was Georgia, this was rural property ownership, and controlled burns were a normal, legal, necessary part of maintaining wooded land. And if anyone had a problem with that, well, they could take it up with Chief Morrison. Something told me he'd be a lot less sympathetic to bogus complaints than he used to be. Back before Linda Patterson had taught everyone in the county about the consequences of making false reports and abusing HOA authority. I smiled at that thought, grabbed my chainsaw, and headed out to tackle the next section of deadfall that needed clearing. Life was good, the neighborhood was healthy, and justice had been served. What more could anyone ask for?